Bom dia a todos. Desculpa, falo muy poco português, so I will give my comments in English. I, first of all, am honored by the opportunity to be here at the Cardoso Foundation, and I thank the foundation for bringing me here to share my views. As Sergio pointed out, the work that I do, I'm part of the Strategic Studies Institute, which is the think tank of the U.S. Army War College. And our job at the War College is to prepare our officers at roughly the colonel level to ascend to general officers, so to do strategic thinking. And so our job at the Strategic Studies Institute is to contribute to strategic thinking about issues of the region and our institution. So my job there is to talk about Latin America and what is strategically important in Latin America. And certainly China and other extra-hemispheric actors and their activities there is part of what is shaping the strategic environment of the region. I should say, though, that as an academic, I have the freedom and something we take very seriously of expression, and so I'm going to share my views as an analyst and as an academic, but they do not necessarily represent the views of the U.S. government or the U.S. Army War College. And so, and I am known to speak very frankly, so please understand that this is not the official position of the U.S. government. So, first of all, and I guess I'll speak sitting down. If I get terribly excited, I may stand up from time to time.
And you can grab a microphone. If you want to stand up, there is a hand microphone.
Oh, perfect. Okay. Okay, I think I'll do this. I find that I keep myself awake better when I stand up.
Please stand up.
So, the question that usually comes up with respect to Chinese activities in Latin America is, what does China want? And what I emphasize is that, to me, China is basically pursuing the same objectives in the region and the globe that it has pursued for the past 3,000 years, which is to have a strong, secure, unified China, and one in which, just like 3,000 years ago, when the barbarian kingdoms would send tribute to China and recognize China as the emperor is the son of heaven. Today, China, within the current world system, desires to be the center of economic flows and the center of prosperity for the Chinese government and the Chinese people. In many ways, when I began teaching on China, Latin America about 15 years ago, I used to assign, ironically, several pieces by, among other people, your president, Cardoso. There's a famous piece on dependent development by Cardoso and a scholar by the name of Feleto, as well as Raul Priebes, Emanuel Wallerstein, and others. And for me, in many ways, the irony is that the structure of value added in which capital flows to China, even while work is realized in other places in peripheral regions, call them Brazil, is very similar to what people like President Cardoso warned about many, many years ago during the 1970s. But I'm getting a little ahead of myself right now. And so when I say, what does China want right now? You can say that the things that China is seeking come out of its position within the current world economy. Reliable access to commodities for its industrial production, foodstuff for the 1.4 billion Chinese people, access to markets, not only selling goods like cheap footwear and toys and shoes, but also as it moves up the value-added chain, and also access to its market for services. Financial services, construction services, logistics services, etc. And technology, because China recognizes, just as Brazil is long recognized, that to be a modern economy, one through state policy has to try to diversify the economy and move to a greater technology continent. And so, for example, China's current Made in China 2025 plan very explicitly seeks to move up that technology value chain. I would also say that China has been, in my judgment, relatively transparent about what it wants and how it engages with the region. So, for example, if you go back to China's 2008 policy white paper towards the region and China's update of that in November 2016, or, for example, if you look at when President Xi Jinping came to Fortaleza, Brazil for the BRICS summit in 2014, and he introduced his 1+3+6 plan. It's remarkable that basically what he said is pretty much what China's done. One, emphasizing the unified nature of Chinese engagement in the region. Three, emphasizing the three channels for that engagement, so commerce, trade, investment, and loans, and the 6 areas. And so, again, talking about primary product manufacturing and foodstuffs, and certain technology categories and construction. You can't say that China has been secret about how and where it wants to engage. Now, I think sometimes we don't fully realize the implications of that, either for Brazil or for the United States. But I think in that aspect that the Chinese have been fairly straightforward. What I would also say is that for me, China is involved in strategic shaping. China has inherited a world not of its making, a world largely shaped by the US and Europe, the post-World War II Bretton Woods system of financing, the United Nations, etc. And so as China has engaged with that world, it has sought to mold that world in ways that are more convenient and more appropriate for the continued rise of China. I would say that includes using what diplomatically it calls its strategic partnerships. China has 9 strategic partnerships in the region, of which Brazil is one of the oldest. And it uses those actively. In Brazil, you have an institution called the COSPAN, and there are similar institutions in other Latin American states for basically shaping the economic projects, and in some cases doing political and other types of coordination. In addition to that, the use of a Chinese style of multilateralism. Even though China, for example, has been very active as an observer in the Organization of American States since 2004, China has chosen to engage through CELAC, an organization which notably excludes the United States and Canada as its principal engagement tool, just as it has used the FOCAC in Africa. China has used other institutions, for example, BRICS, and more recently the BRICS Plus, which brings in Mexico and others, as a way of engaging multilaterally but across regions. China has engaged actively through other Asian infrastructure, Asia Industrial Infrastructure Bank, which brings many Latin American countries in. It has chose to engage through a commerce oriented way of having free trade. Its concept of the free trade area of the Asia Pacific, which builds on an Asian structure called RCEP, as opposed to the more high-end TPP, or the now TPP-11, which puts more emphasis on things such as the protection of intellectual property and associated dispute resolution mechanisms. Also, we find that China is using its banking transactions and commerce transactions to try to shape the international financial system in ways that would advance the use of the RMB as an international reserve currency. So in Brazil, as you know, you have the $30 billion currency swap arrangement that China negotiated. In Argentina, there was a similar arrangement. You have Chile, with the People's Bank of China being selected as the vehicle for currency clearing. In many of the major transactions also that China does for soy and other commodities, China creates vehicles for doing those in renminbi. Again, these are all part of a concerted effort to really advance the renminbi, and that has strategic implications for the dollar and strategic implications for the world economic system. But so what I'm emphasizing here again is that although China is emphasizing mostly economic things, that economic orientation does not make it any the less strategic, nor any the less impactful for Brazil or for the United States or for the region. And moreover, the fact that it is pursuing these economic objectives does not mean that it is also not doing things that strategically shape the environment in ways that I believe we all need to think about. So let me talk a little bit about China's business engagement in Latin America. So I'm going to switch over so I don't ignore this side of the room. What I want to emphasize is that, as you know, China, although China began its opening towards the world system in 1978 with Deng Xiaoping, really it was in 2001 when China joined the World Trade Organization that we began to notice what was an exponential takeoff in trade. However, it wasn't until about 2009 that China began to invest on the ground in Latin America. There were some projects, but this made a big difference. During this period, there were a lot of business contacts being made. There were a lot of financial infrastructures being created, reciprocal investment protection agreements and things like that. But in 2008, as you recall, with the financial crisis that started in the U.S. and in Europe, and also the blossoming of the Chinese companies and networks for doing business, you really began to see the takeoff. You may remember many of the mergers and acquisitions here in Brazil, for example, in the petroleum sector. You had the acquisition of the Peregrino oil field. You had the acquisition of other assets from other organizations by Sinopec and others. You had similar things in Argentina. You had advances in the mining sector, especially in Peru, but also here in Brazil, for example, ECE mining. You had advances in the manufacturing sector, so companies such as Cherry in Jacaré, companies such as Jack and others. And so I would argue that this really shifted us into a different stage of the relationship, because just as with U.S. and Western companies, the presence on the ground, even though China has been very clear that its official policy is not to meddle in the internal affairs of Latin American countries, China indirectly found that it had interests in protecting its companies, trying to get mergers and acquisitions approved, in winning contracts for the companies who are established in the country. One could mention State Grid, for example. China has interest in protecting its workers now on the ground. China found that as it moved into the region, countries such as, for example, in Colombia, where the purchase of Emerald Energy meant that Chinese oil workers were working in very dangerous conditions, getting kidnapped, for example, in 2010 in Caquetá, Colombia, etc. And so China discovered that it had to find the balance between not interfering in the political sense, but at the same time, what would the Chinese embassy and the consulates in places like Rio and Sao Paulo and other places do when the Chinese companies legitimately needed help or assistance or coordination? And it's a fine line between help and non-interference. And finally, I would argue that we are moving into a new period now, and there was a coincidence of two things. I think one is the maturation of understanding. One of my longtime Chinese friends and colleagues, Jiang Sushui, used to give a presentation, and I borrowed the notion of the panda and the dragon. For many in Latin America, although a dragon is actually a beautiful thing in Chinese culture, but we in the U.S. see it as frightening. But the idea is China the lovable panda that will rescue Latin America and give it an opportunity for development, or is it the fierce dragon that will eat Latin America? I think over time what has happened is that we've gotten away from the threat versus savior and moved towards a more balanced notion of China as a difficult partner with advantages and dangers which are different than dealing with Western governments. In some cases better, in some cases worse. So let me talk now about what I see as some of the strategic trends in Latin America. So one of the things that I would emphasize is this notion that China is getting better. Chinese companies are getting better at using its commercial presence. In general, I think it's accurate that Chinese state-owned enterprises tend to be somewhat clumsy in dealing with the local context. But even there, you have, for example, just to look in Peru, you find some companies such as China Aluminum Company, Chinalco, who have done some very sophisticated things dealing with local partners, working with local contracting firms, or, for example, if we look at Huawei here, which is not a state-owned company, but Huawei has been very smart in adapting itself and its managers to the local circumstance. They even use famous Brazilian football stars here to identify. And in Colombia, it's the same thing. Sponsoring Santa Fe, which is one of the big soccer teams in Bogota, for example. There are other companies, Chinese companies, for example, China Min Metals, which bought into a almost $6 billion mining project, Los Bambas, from the Australians. Maybe came in too quickly, but has had some grave problems. But I think in general, the sophistication of Chinese companies is growing. It's like saying in the 70s, Japanese cars were seen as very poor quality, etc. But today, the Japanese companies, the trading companies, have become very sophisticated with very high quality products. The Chinese also are learning. They're getting their quality up. They're becoming more sophisticated local actors. And as they do so, they're going to increasingly not, there's a phrase in English, they're not going to be continuing to punch below their weight. They're going to be increasingly effective as local actors. And also, one notices that Chinese companies are doing better risk assessment. There are some reasons why China got itself into the mess in Venezuela, going back to the days when Chen Yuan was head of China Development Bank and loans to Venezuela were officially blessed. One can argue that China rushed in too quickly and now has to deal with the consequences. But I think China is getting better also at risk assessment, that the attitude that just because it's a blessed government-to-government deal does not mean it's safe. The United States discovered that state loans can be defaulted, and China is discovering that state projects can turn out poorly. Number two, you've probably noticed that China has built much of its engagement around One Belt, One Road. And so you see that with the recent declarations that Trinidad is officially going to be part of One Belt, One Road. Panama has a role in One Belt, One Road. Now, it's interesting because you notice that neither in the maritime route nor the land route has Latin America actually been connected. But there is this sense that Latin America wants to believe that it will somehow share in the wealth and the resources that come from One Belt, One Road. And I think right now the Chinese government is very much on the fence, using One Belt, One Road to interest Latin America in that, but hasn't quite said that Latin America is on the route. They're just associated with the route. We're kind of in the middle there. Number three is this plan orientation. The Chinese, by style, in my personal opinion, are passionate planners. You've noticed that in China-Latin America engagement, when they first did the engagement with CELAC, they did the China-CELAC 5-year plan. And most recently in Santiago, this January, a new 3-year joint action plan. Last week, when the group of Chinese were here in Brazil, they actually, one of the outcomes of the meeting that was just conducted was to encourage Brazilians to do more planning. And so, to me, this idea of trying to advance the relationship through these plans is something that's very much part of the Chinese style of engagement. I'll talk about boldness. I'm going to go a little bit quicker in the interest of time because I tend to have often too much to say for any amount of time that I'm ever given. One thing that you also see is the question of, is China exporting a development model? And it's interesting because the Chinese always say, we are not telling, Latin America or anybody else how to run your government. But in the 19th Party Congress, the Chinese openly said, well, perhaps some could find in the Chinese example, with Chinese hubris, a development model. And indeed, if you look at the way in which Chinese, in cases like Venezuela and others, send technical teams to try to to do coordination or teach coordination in project management. The Chinese clearly are helping Latin Americans and others to plan their development. Although they haven't come out and said in kind of U.S. style, this is how we believe that you should run either your country or economy. But there's a fine line there with what planning means. It's also important to emphasize that Chinese are getting better at people-to-people relationships. For me, this is ironic because much of our relationship in the U.S. with Latin America back in the days of President John F. Kennedy came from that inspiration of people who went to the United States to study those people-to-people relationships and goodwill. The fact that there are a few people in this audience who can understand me in my English, is a testament to the power of English as a language, a second language in Latin America. And while the Chinese often lament that there are few people who speak Mandarin, and I tell you, I dramatically failed myself. It's really, really hard. But the fact that already some 2,000 Latin Americans have gone to China, Hanban has been talking about 6,000 or more scholarships. There are already 39 Confucius Institutes for officially teaching China. And it's interesting. I remember back in 2009, 2010, one of my Brazilian colleagues explaining to me, I was asking, how is it that Brazil can be half of Latin America, but only has 2 Confucius Institutes at a time when Mexico has 5? And they said, well, sometimes, Evan, we Brazilians can be very inward-looking. But I've noticed that when Brazil puts its mind to something, oftentimes it can do it with great speed. So Brazil now has 10 Confucius Institutes, one in many of the major Brazilian states. And so I've noticed that Brazil actually now leads Latin America twice as many as the next competitor, which is Mexico. And so these people-to-people relationships are strengthening. I would also say, and I'm going to come back to this in the next slide, Brazil right now, for a number of reasons, is actually the focus of Chinese investment. There's probably no place in Latin America is receiving more investment. Literally a half of all Chinese investment, a half of investment in recent years has gone to Brazil. And I think that trend will continue. And I'll talk about that in a minute. And it's across all sectors. It's in places that never before has it happened, such as commercial logistics, port projects, airport projects, construction projects. In part, it's because of the size of the Brazilian economy, but frankly, it's also because of certain changes that have occurred here. Both in Brazil and elsewhere, for example, the Chinese construction companies and development banks have taken great advantage of the collapse of Odebrecht and the problems of other companies like Braskem, etc. Technology cooperation is something that's very important, as you know, with the Cybers program here in Brazil, but also satellite launches in Venezuela, in Bolivia, also in other places, and the expansion of technology companies doing infrastructure, such as Huawei and ZTE, that have always had a very strong presence here in Brazil. Military cooperation. There are Chinese companies, for example, even involved in the bidding for the Brazilian Navy's new frigate program, as well as Cesigas on the Navy side. I won't talk about Army collaboration right now, but security collaboration, you also see that according to the new 5-year plan, the Chinese are beginning to cooperate more in police and trans-Pacific organized crime because, frankly, most Latin American governments have very few technical contacts for how to deal with Chinese triads and other groups or Chinese criminals that are, oftentimes in Latin American communities that don't even speak Mandarin, that speak Hakka or Cantonese. There was an interesting case in Argentina taking down a Chinese triad called Pishui. And I think this type of collaboration we're going to see it more in the future. And it's explicitly mentioned in the China Select Plan. And then, of course, the obvious point we'll talk about in a moment, which is the diplomatic truce between China and Taiwan is now officially over. It started in Africa with Gambia and later Sao Tome and Principe. Then, of course, the recognition last year of Panama, most recently the Dominican Republic, and the question of who is next. But those fights, the countries, the 10 countries, with the exception of Paraguay, and it seems doubtful right now that the new Abdo government in Paraguay will make that change, but you never know. But the rest of the countries are all very close to the United States. They are in the Caribbean and Central America. And so this new struggle for diplomatic recognition and the associated projects and diplomatic advances will all occur very close to the United States and will probably coincide with the President Andrés Manuel López Obrador in Mexico leading a new anti-Trump Mexican nationalism, reasserting Mexico's traditional leadership role in Central America, in the Caribbean. So I think there could be a combination of things that make life very uncomfortable for the United States in terms of how that struggle plays out. So let me talk about a few things of PRC investment in Latin America. Again, as you notice, literally of the $113 billion of investment since 2003, $55 billion in confirmed projects have gone to Brazil. And so when I say, what is my #1 trend, and I don't do this just because I'm in Brazil with the generosity of the Cardozo Foundation. I actually, I said this in Santiago last November as well, so there's proof this is not the first time. But 262 projects, of which about 117 are confirmed. Of those 117, again, just this year, $30 billion in new announced investment. So again, it's a huge amount. And it's in many sectors. Probably the biggest sector of activity through mergers and acquisition and others is the electricity sector, generation and transmission. The biggest mover, of course, is State Grid. Actually, when I was in China, I had the opportunity to meet with people in State Grid. I was impressed at how they are doing planning for not only entering the Brazilian market, but training their managers and personnel for understanding the Brazilian context. But you can see, for example, again, the role in Belo Monte. You can see that the big one is the acquisition of CPFL, something that is still being finalized. But as a complement to that, you have, and the plans that State Grid has now that they're here to invest a lot in transmission capabilities, maybe $40 billion in the next 5 years, a huge amount. That's complemented by other Chinese giants. State Power Investment Corporation, which again recently acquired Pacific Hydro, and with that very important hydroelectric and wind assets in Chile, in Brazil. Of course, the acquisition of Duke Energy by China Three Gorges, another $1 billion project. The possibility that the Chinese will be the company, just like in Argentina, building out Brazil's possible continuation of the Angra 3 nuclear facility. What happens if Electrobras is put up for sale? So there's a lot in the electricity sector. There's also a lot in logistics. There used to be a time when Hutchison Whampoa, Hutchison Port Holdings, was the major logistics activity aside from China shipping. That's no longer the case. The biggest new activity is happening in Brazil. China Communications Construction Corporation is actually going forward with 2 major terminals, one in the south, one in the north. China Merchants Port Holding is going forward with another major project. On the aviation side, Hainan, HNA, is, of course, as you know, now operating or is going to soon be operating the Galeão Airport in Rio de Janeiro. Talk about a train line. Other things, even here in Sao Paulo, China Gazuba Group, it appears, will be operating the new facility for providing drinking water here in Sao Paulo. In agriculture, you probably remember that some of the big projects like Chongqing Grain and Bahia State were effectively stopped indirectly by some of the major commercial logistics, agricultural logistics giant, Bunge, Dreyfus, Cargill, etc. But you see that in many ways, There's a lot of new, smaller movement. So small companies like Pengxin, which has made some small acquisitions in the country. The purchase of a seed company by Yuan Longping with the backing of CITIC Bank from Dow AgroSciences, etc. Even the purchase by COFCO, or at least the proposed purchase of the Renuka sugar facility in Sao Paulo here. So there's a lot of things that little by little are going on. Finance also. When we talk about finance, we often talk about we think of development banks, China Development Bank, China Exim Bank, but there's a lot of other things. So, for example, the entry of ICBC and China Construction Bank into branch banking services in support of both Chinese and local companies. Other things that are in the finance category. So you may know of this purchase of the Torre Sculptura by Fosun, and Fosun talking about now moving in and buying various hospitals and other things in the area, as well as the currency swaps and other arrangements. Medicine, telecom. I'm going to speed up a little bit in the interest of time.
You still have 10 minutes, I guess.
10 minutes. Perfect. That's something very, very dangerous to tell me, but thank you.
So you have 5.
Okay. Perfect. Okay. So anyway, so I hope I've painted a picture of a lot of activities in a lot of sectors in Brazil. But let me put this in the broader Latin American context also. So as you see, renewable energy, basically using new technologies and loans. If you look at nuclear, if you look at hydroelectric, if you look at wind, if you look at solar, Chinese companies are making major advances across Latin America. Again, just a few examples here. In the area of mining, again, although there's a lot of mining activity in Peru, about $10 billion in programmed investment just in the coming years. There was just an announcement, for example, that Toromocho is going to be expanding another $1.3 billion plus building a new $2 billion port expansion to get those minerals out. But even in places where mining was relatively restricted. So as you know, in Chile, the government does not permit the expansion of copper mines. There was an advance purchase agreement with Codelco going back to 2005. However, the Chinese have done something very interesting in some newer sectors, especially things like lithium. There's a company, SQM, a Chinese company called Tianqi, just purchased a 24% interest, a $4.3 billion stake, again, largely in lithium and in other materials in the north of Chile. Also, as you're aware, some significant Chinese advances in rare earths. CBMM, which had a very important presence here in Brazil. Of course, that was a $2 billion investment many years ago. Now talk that China Molybdenum is looking to buy the niobium operations of Anglo American. So there's a lot of interesting advances in non-traditional mining, even while still companies like Vale here tend to wrestle with this idea of, is China a competitor or is China a client? Petroleum, again, it's not just about Venezuela and Ecuador. You see advances in Peru, advances in Mexico with the new oil rounds in CNODC in the Perdido Basin. Again, the very important advance here in Brazil with CNODC and CNPC in the offshore Libra fields. Of course, the continued partnership with Petrobras. My sense is that Petrobras's problems have in many ways strengthened the Chinese position. Argentina going forward, even in the Caribbean, certain activities are going forward. But this is not to say that Chinese are not without their problems. So, for example, I mentioned the Sinochem acquisition of the Peregrino field. My understanding is that for Sinochem, petroleum is not one of its core areas, and Sinochem found itself in the position where it is considering selling off Peregrino, as I understand. So sometimes we assume that everything Chinese is a straight advance, and that's not always the case. Logistics, I mentioned the many projects in Brazil. Ironically, the difficulties of Odebrecht have not only benefited the Chinese here in Brazil, but also elsewhere. So Odebrecht had won a project for broadening and doing a number of works on the Magdalena River, one of the principal river arteries in Colombia. When Odebrecht ran into problems, Sinohydro, or actually China, who had lost the previous attempt to win this project, came in and said, well, we understand that you don't want to deal with Odebrecht anymore, so we're happy to come in and take over the project. We see in Panama, of course, with the new relations, the new advances in Margarita Island, a new $1 billion investment, plus other investments that don't even make the news. So China Harbor using its own capital to build out a cruise ship terminal. Caraway, a relatively small company doing a natural gas facility, again, in Panama. Peru, I mentioned before the new minerals port Chanque. Bolivia, first I thought this was fake news when I saw that China Overseas Shipping Company was establishing an office in La Paz. But in actuality, it's true because Bolivia, as you know, has treaty access with Chile to the port of Arica, and so politically the Chinese are astute enough to say, okay, we're not going to put the office in Arica, Chile, for a Bolivian operation. We're going to put the office in La Paz. But again, there are a lot of advances in construction. Some of the interesting things happening in construction. The Chinese are increasingly not just doing loan-based projects in places like Venezuela, but they're doing public-private partnerships. They're putting their own money in. So in Jamaica, the north-south highway, where in return for real estate loaned by the Jamaican government, they are putting their own capital there. Of course, you may have heard of the Baja Mar complex, a $4.2 billion hotel investment made in the Bahamas, in Nassau. You can see in roads, even in Santiago, Chile, the Chinese are actually starting to compete and win. And if Chinese companies can win in the Chilean procurement system, it's an evidence of the advances that they're making. Manufacturing, as you know, that the Chinese had very, very bad timing. The Chinese have always been attracted to big markets such as Brazil and made a lot of investments with local partners in CKD manufacturing facilities, such as the Cherry and Jack facility. Horrible timing because they put all of that money in right before the bottom fell out in the Brazilian consumer products and auto market. But I understand that are still struggling with that and have had some success in smaller markets such as Bogota and even Quito. There's a small manufacturing facility. Again, branch banking, I mentioned not just loans, but actually working in branch banking in Brazil, in Argentina, even in Mexico, now in Panama. I mentioned the diplomatic struggle, so I'm going to skip over that in the interest of time. I mentioned telecommunications and space. We can come back to that in other times. And again, we can come back to the military issues if you want to. I have many things I can say about that, but I want to get to the last slide because it was really the point of the whole talk. Which is, okay, opportunities versus challenges. And I want to say just out in the open, there are a lot of reasons that attract Latin American governments and other players to work with China. Obviously, Chinese companies for commercial partners, individuals, not governments, are seen, if you can, if the commercial partner can just tap into a Chinese partner, being able to get the work of the Chinese company. Typically, the commercial partner provides the local knowledge and legal representation and things like that. The Chinese company not only provides the production capability and sometimes the workers, but oftentimes the access to their banking partner, which gets a lot of loans. In addition to that, the idea, the dream of vast access to the Chinese markets. There is an example of this in just about every country. In Ecuador, for example, one of the wealthy Ecuadorian, it was said that a Chinese Ecuadorian by the name of Segundo Wong said that if every Chinese would just eat one Ecuadorian banana each week, that Ecuador would be a wealthy country. In Colombia, there's a story of well, if every Chinese would just eat a pound of Colombian beef, and any country you find a similar. China involves dreams that come from large numbers, and that has a certain magic and soft power if you can just tap into that with local partners. In addition to that, also, this is something that happens a lot in Brazil and in Mexico, the use of Chinese companies in supply chains. So many textile companies in Colombia have begun importing cloth from China. In places like Manaus, the industrial zone there, for example, importing Chinese components so that Brazilian products can be more competitive. In addition to that, of course, the idea of China as a font for national development, providing infrastructure projects and other projects that otherwise couldn't be possible. And for some countries, Venezuela comes to mind, Bolivia, this idea of China providing leverage against Western institutions such as the IMF and leverage politically against the United States. This idea of, we don't have to bow to Washington anymore because, now the Chinese are there as a source of financing, et cetera. However, as you know, there are risks that come with those challenges. And so you notice that even though I come from Washington, I'm trying to be balanced, although I craftily put the challenges in dangerous red. But what you see is, first of all, there's always a risk of the local partner being outmaneuvered with an improper understanding. Probably one of the biggest cases was Sarkis's Mirlian with the new Baha Mar facility in the Bahamas, where again, a very savvy gentleman, very knowledgeable about local politics in the Bahamas. But when the project ran into problems and they went into bankruptcy, the bankruptcy was decided in, I believe it was a Hong Kong court by Chinese rules. And in the end, Sarkis's Mirlian was forced out. And then another Chinese Macau-based organization, Chow Tai Fook Enterprises, basically bought it at a song, and it's now completely under Chinese control. Some stories turn out well, some stories turn out badly, but some do turn out badly. Something, and again, going back ironically to the words of people like your own President Cardoso, the risk of extractivism. If you look at the change in where Brazil's exports have been realized over the last 15 years, you actually do see what is referred to as a reprioritization. And it's not just in Brazil. But what has happened is that, on the one hand, Chinese manufacturers have not only penetrated Brazilian markets, but have also displaced Brazilian companies from third markets in Europe and other parts of Latin America. Even while Chinese investments in Brazil have concentrated on expanding efficiencies in extractive sectors, such as, again, iron and soy and things like that. The net result of that competition and the investment subsidies in extractive industries is that Brazil is was doing well, but Brazil's prosperity in many ways is becoming increasingly reliant on relatively low value added extractive industries. And this is a risk for the entire region because, as China recognizes, it's not just about commerce, it's about using the state and negotiating in coordination between the state and companies so that the leverages of access to the markets and resources ultimately advance the state towards and the people towards higher value added in their own countries. This question then, it's fascinating if you look at the growth in Chinese banks and the growth of other in the growth of Chinese companies, that we are moving towards a world. If people like Emanuel Wallerstein, and I'm actually pretty conservative, but I never hesitate to use the words of people like Emanuel Wallerstein, we're moving towards a world that's unthinkable to us in the United States and in Europe, a world in which the principal ownership of capital and the associated decisions are no longer exclusively made in Washington and the capitals of Europe, but increasingly, and they're still passing by Latin America, but they're increasingly being made in China. And as the nature of decisions of capital owners in China and returns to capital in China, will that be a world that for Latin America will be better or worse or the same as the exploitative world of Western domination that we now seem to be slowly transitioning past? There's also a question of leverage, that with access to markets, sometimes there's economic leverage, such as, for example, the leverage that China put on Argentina in 2010 when Argentina was doing a lot of anti-dumping cases, and China suddenly stopped importing about $2 billion a year in Argentine soy. And suddenly Hector Tinerman, the foreign minister, and then Cristina Fernandez de Kirchner found time to run to China. Kind of going back to the days when the barbarian kings would come to the Forbidden City and asking for favors. And at the end of the day, there was no quid pro quo, but Argentina agreed to give about $10 billion in railway projects to China. And miraculously, COFCO renewed the acceptance of Argentine soy oil. And then finally, one thing that worries me is how the democratic discourse is changing. China's style of applying pressure, I would argue, is very different than that of the US. We tend to be very kind of law and principle organized. Well, I won't even go into the current administration. But one of the things that you find is that the Chinese are very, very good at saving face, but that does not mean that there's any less pressure. There are many foundations I've seen in the United States that have business interests in China. It's typical for any major foundation to have an Asia practice or contracts in Asia. Universities oftentimes have branches and interests in Asia or attract Chinese students. Governments, of course, also have a lot of interest in doing business with the Chinese. And so there is an increasing and worrisome tendency that I've seen at self-censorship. So to avoid losing the markets or to avoid losing the possibility of future business, sometimes it's even just a warning. Well, this wouldn't be helpful in winning new business. And those warnings have a chilling effect, whether it's giving, providing visas for certain people who might be objectionable to the Chinese, or whether it's including a certain thing that's critical to China in a report that's written by the organization. In many different ways, what worries me is that the growing power of Chinese capital and Chinese markets is impinging in 1,000 small ways on the democratic discourse that we've been accustomed to love. It was interesting. I had the opportunity, really the honor, to speak with a Brazilian journalist who put to me a very difficult question, and that was, how can the United States say that you are a better partner or better for the region? Look at all what President Trump has done, and I'd like to say that I was very erudite and very concise in my response. I really wasn't, but I started thinking about it. And at the end of the day, I think the point is that when we look back 10 years from now, whether or not the U.S. is a good strategic communicator, will the world that Latin America and Brazil lives in 10 years from now, will we be looking back with nostalgia at the world that we had right now? Say, I miss the old days of listening to President Trump and all of those things. I think at the end of the day, what is clear is that it's important not only for the United States but for Latin America to think about its interest and work in a coordinated fashion to advance its economic interests and its political interests as effectively as China has been able to advance its own globally. And with that, I'll rest, and I look forward to Q&A. Thank you very much.